listening to Truth or Dare to Share by Ambitiously Intuitive.
Welcome to the latest episode of Truth or Dare to Share. We are talking about probably one of my favorite movies of all time, Pride and Prejudice, today. And we've got a skeleton crew with Cynthia and myself. And hopefully by this point, you know us well enough that we can just bypass introductions so we can jump directly into reactions to a classic, timeless book. So Cynthia, since I have a tendency to space fill and take up the mic, do you want to start with your reaction to Pride and Prejudice?
Sure. So I love this story. I actually watched the BBC version, the miniseries of this with my mom when I was a kid. And I didn't realize there was a book. And then when the movie came out, obviously everybody loved the movie, right? I read it in college, and I used to put it on before I would go to bed because the music and the setting is just so soothing. So, yeah. And honestly, the other thing I would say too is I feel like this story is really heartwarming in a way, and it feels like, just a nice hug, I guess.
A nice hug. That's so
Yeah.
sweet. Do you remember? I'll give mine and feel free to interject at any time. I remember the first time I came across this story, it was while watching You've Got Mail, because uh, what is Meg Ryan's character, Shop Girl, when she's writing with Tom Hanks' character? I didn't prepare You've Got Mail. It came pretty organically. But that's what they bonded over, or at least it's what he was antagonizing her by saying, was Mr. Darcy full of pride, or was he prejudiced, or was Elizabeth Bennet full of pride or prejudice? And so when I watched that movie when I must have been 10, I think that's when I first got exposed to the title. I never saw the BBC version, and it's on my list of things to do to watch. It's with Colin Firth, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So good.
Yeah,
so good.
I would watch it just because
Colin Firth is like,
yeah.
Well,
it
also, Bridget Jones. So
yeah, I was about to say that's probably the main reason I would watch it, is because I'm more familiar with him, the homage that Bridget Jones is to Pride and Prejudice. That's the story that I'm more familiar with. But I have a
love
friend
Bridget Jones.
who doesn't love Bridget Jones. I don't know about Bridget Jones' Baby. I still watched it, but the first Bridget Jones, absolutely. But talking about when you said watching it before going to sleep, that's why if I had to be on a desert island and only watch one movie over and over again, this would probably be that movie, because it does feel like a warm blanket, a warm hug. It's really a comfort rewatch of mine. And I probably stole that from a friend that I was close with, that I keep up with to this day. Every time I would stay the night at her house, I think I was maybe 17 or 18, and we would go out in Seville in Pensacola, Florida, and I'd asked my mom, can I stay the night at her house? She put it on DVD. So that can tell you this is pre-Netflix days, during my late teenage years.
I
And
owned
she'd
it
put it
on
on
DVD.
every night, every time that we stayed there. And so that's how I learned about it. You started to describe how it made you feel. I I think I've talked about Little Women a lot, and I'm really inspired by any stories that were set in the 1800s where women defied societal standards or what was expected of them. And just like Jo March and Little Women, Elizabeth Bennet does that for me, where it's very clear from the very opening she values family above all things, but she also goes on her own path. It's not societal standards for her to walk everywhere, and she gets made fun of in the book for the hem of her dress being dirty. Uh, she isn't really interested in learning how to play piano elegantly, and she would much rather read or hang out with her best friend that's her sister. And so anybody who embodies main character energy, anytime they're watching Elizabeth Bennet, one of the girls are in the background. Totally okay. Talk about family values.
She wanted oranges.
Okay. I mean, that takes precedence to anything else. Well, you should tell me more about when you say, like, I'd like to hear you expand on Warm Blanket. Like, what are your favorite parts of the movie?
I mean, obviously the end, the music is so good there too. And honestly, I think though my favorite part is when they're leaving the party, the one that her mom made them stay really late, the 30 extra minutes, and they have to wait to get their carriage. So they're the last people to leave.
Yeah.
And especially in the movie, because Darcy, he gives her his hand, and like there's this tension between them that they both notice. And I think
Hmm.
that is probably my favorite part besides the end.
Yeah, the ending is great. My favorite part is, and I was rereading, or I listened to the Audible in preparation for this conversation, because I did read the book in college. That was after I had seen the movie, and I've seen the movie probably 100 times. That might be hyperbole, but it feels like that's how many times I've seen it. And so I was listening to the Audible, and the actress who plays the sister who plays Jane, her name is escaping me right now, but she's the one who does the Audible. She's in Gone Girl.
Yeah, what is her name? Wrote?
Uh,
No. Gosh, what is her name? Let me look it
oh,
up.
I'm looking it up because I can't. It's going to drive me nuts. Rosamund Pike.
Yeah.
Starting. So it's really pleasant listening to the Audible, and it's also interesting having seen the movie so many times and then listening to it here recently, being able to see the differences between the two. And this exact burn doesn't happen the same way in the book that it does in the movie, but it's when she's talking about poetry and she says, poetry can kill love dead, like it's stout love dead. And he's like, oh, I thought poetry was the food of love. And then she expands her thought and he's like, well, what do you recommend then? Like to encourage affection. And it's after she found out when she was under, I don't know, like she was in
The,
a background scene. You know
yeah,
what I'm
the
talking about?
dancing when she was talking about dancing.
Yeah. And uh, I should have written down all of these characters in advance, but when Mr. Darcy is talking to Bingley and Bingley is talking about Jane, he's like, oh my God, she's the most beautiful creature I've ever beheld. And he's like, oh, but her sister, like she's handsome too. And it's always interesting to hear how we've transformed the word handsome. And he's like, you were dancing with the only handsome girl in the world. Like she's perfectly tolerable, but like not handsome enough to tempt me. So flash forward to my favorite scene is when he gives her the alley oop and sets her up and is like, so what do you recommend to encourage affection? And she's like, dancing, even if one's partner is barely tolerable. And I'm just like,
Yeah, it's so
every
good.
single time,
So
so
good.
good.
Unfortunately, I listened to the audiobook too, but I did not have the Rosamund Pike version. I had the older version, I guess. But
That's okay. I
yeah,
I I appreciate the British, or I mean that she's from the UK.
yeah.
I appreciate the British accent and she does mimic. Sometimes it bothers me in audibles because I you listen to audibles well before me, but something that drives me nuts is when they don't bring in other actors to do the other voices. So it's one person replicating it. It was, dare I say, tolerable with Rosamund Pike doing it, given her gift for the arts.
Yeah, they usually only if it's a really big book, they'll bring that in, bring in multiple narrators.
I couldn't finish Death on the Nile because of the actor who had a British accent was mimicking other voices. It drove me nuts, but I could handle it with Rosamund Pike doing it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should pivot since we organically went into more of Act Two, which is us asking each other questions. What part, I asked you your favorite part of the movie, what part made you cringe the most?
Probably when because I will say this, like, I feel like this is a bit of miscommunication again. Like, Lizzie, I think that the most cringeworthy part is when she is like trying to seek the affection of Wickham,
Mm,
and then when the letter part happens and then she realizes, I really do appreciate that she is able to reconsider to what he tells her and to readjust her thinking. I think that that's pretty great. So from the cringe to how she made it better, I guess.
mm. Mine is probably when they're at that ball, the ball you're talking about, the second one, after the mother
Oh,
forces him to hold a ball, like, oh, you must hold a ball. And he's like, okay. anytime the mother's on screen.
Oh yeah.
Even though on the flip side, the dynamic between the mother and the father, when she says like, "Oh, my poor nerves," and he's like, "Oh, I love your nerves. They've been my constant companion these last 20 years."
Oh gosh, that reminds me of when the mom is like at the beginning of the book when she's so excited that Mr. Bingley is coming and tries to get Mr. Bennett to like go and talk to him, but he's already done it, and it's just like, oh geez, Louise. And then I also was thinking about this too, that when Lizzie is trying to when she is sort of like when Mr. Lucas, right? Yeah, Mr. Lucas is trying to basically ask her to marry him. So that's also.
Oh,
really
you're talking about Mr. Collins.
Oh, Mr. Collins, not
Mr. Collins and his obsession with Catherine de Bourgh.
Yes. Oh God. Yes. And then his speech too. Yeah. And then at the same party that you were talking about too, Mr. Collins, when he is trying to talk to Mr. Darcy.
Because in those times he needed to be properly introduced. Because if you, in the book, that's what's really lovely about the book, is obviously they expand on all of this. And in the movie, I thought they did a really good job digesting. I mean, the Audible is like, what, 11 hours? So taking 11 hours and bringing it down to a 2-hour story was really interesting. But they do expand that of the status of Mr. Darcy, that he wouldn't be allowed to do that. But that whole party was cringeworthy, from Mary playing the piano and singing off key and everybody making fun of her. The mother is already bragging about Mr. Bingley proposing to Jane.
And she gets super drunk.
Yeah, she gets drunk. She's like kicking her feet, like being like, "We expect a most advantageous marriage." I'm not really committing to the British accent, if you can't tell. Like, I want to, but I would need to watch the movie to then replicate it. And then Lydia and Kitty are just causing chaos everywhere they go. They're just copy paste versions of their mothers, but out in high society.
Yeah, they're enjoying life. They're enjoying their lives.
When Elizabeth Bennet is like looking at Charlotte and says, like, "I wonder if my family's having a competition on who can embarrass themselves the most." So what questions do you have on your docket?
So one of the questions, well, it's sort of statement, sort of question. So the original name for this book was First Impressions. It wasn't actually Pride and Prejudice. And I guess in the first drafts, I was like looking it up. It talked about how this book was originally written as letters. And I thought that was a really cool concept. Obviously, there's a lot of letters already in this story, but I guess how would this book have been different if it was just written in letters instead of I guess also, conversation?
Well, what's your reaction to that?
I think it would have been pretty interesting, but I do like seeing everyone's immediate reactions to things, obviously, immediately, rather than having to wait for their response, or how the responses would be, what order they would be in, and what characters we would be interacting with.
I would be curious how that would be adapted to a movie. I do like the idea of reading a book comprised solely of letters, especially because I guess my question for you would be, what you think was the most meaningful letter in the book? And as I was just listening to the Audible, I think that the one where Mr. Darcy, after he proposed and she shut him down, that to me was the turning point of like the peak, where she realized, and this is where, going back to Tom Hanks' question to Meg Ryan and You've Got Mail, like, who was full of pride and who was prejudice? And I think the short answer is it was both of them. But
Absolutely,
it was the one.
It was both of them.
Yeah, that'll be my question to you in a second. So think on that, is where did they each exude pride and where did they each exude prejudice? But going back, before we get to that, going back to your point on the book comprised solely of letters, I think that we would have learned more about their vulnerability, because there was a lot of miscommunication, which I think you've made that point already, or at least you and I've talked about it when you and I've talked about this book or movie not being recorded on a podcast. Yeah, I think we would have learned more about each character. Like, there's more that I would like to know about Lydia, or like, what would Mr. Wickham have said? what would it look like between Bingley and Darcy, because you know that their friendship is close, but we don't always see that closeness. It's always talked about in third party. So I think that that probably would have been an interesting take to learn about everybody else, as opposed to it being solely focused on Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. So tell me, where did you see pride and where did you see prejudice from each of the main characters?
Well, I think immediately from the beginning, you see it with both, right? So at the party, uh, Mr. Darcy feels very proud about his status. And honestly, I think Lizzie does too. I think she feels proud of her family. I think she does see where her family, when, as you mentioned, when she talks about being embarrassed of her family. And then, obviously the prejudice is, when Mr. Darcy basically tells Bingley not to marry Jane. And then I think Lizzie, she had her feelings about Darcy. Like her immediate first impression of him was that he was full of himself and very proud. And, I think that, again, like the miscommunication or not really understanding who each other were. There's a really good quote. I was trying to find it. I thought I'd written it down, but I didn't. But it talks about how basically they were in it. By the time they realized they were in it, it was already the middle. And I think that is sort of shows like their pride and their prejudice.
I didn't write down this quote either. The prejudice, I think, is pretty obvious. One piece I'll add, because I always, and this is me being biased towards Lizzie, saw the pride in Mr. Darcy and him wanting to control things or him wanting to be a certain way, because they expand a lot more in the book about how proud he was of saving Bingley from a disadvantageous marriage. But I didn't really understand the pride part until I reread the book recently, because she values being right and her being able to read people. And so she realized that she had a pride in her. I think the phrasing that I'm trying to summon right now is her ability to discern people. Because the thing about the movie is that's different in the book is I feel like the movie is totally from Elizabeth Bennet's perspective, whereas the book is written from a third party perspective and you're seeing everything play out. And I think that given how many times I've seen the movie, I rarely think about it from a third party perspective.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think that the movie is most certainly from Lizzie's perspective. I think also, I was just thinking about this too. Another section of the movie that I would say that you could see her being proud was when she is like on the swing sitting outside and the seasons are passing by, sort of, because it's sort of like regret or she did not want to marry Mr. Collins, and now she's sort of in this like unhappy state before she goes and visits them.
Yeah, I could definitely see her having pride when it comes to her marrying Mr. Collins would have been her settling, and even her father's pride. Her father's like, nobody's good enough for Lizzie. Like that's the mom. Clearly there's an interesting dynamic between.
She doesn't like Lizzie. She
doesn't like her. She is her least favorite, and for Mr. Collins to choose her least favorite, but the pride that the father has that that's who he values the most, because Elizabeth Bennet has set these standards for herself and refuses to succumb to societal expectations.
And I think he sees a lot of himself in her as well.
Yeah, well, that's, I would say, one of my favorite scenes when you were talking about at the end, as we both have, like the beautiful scene of Mr. Darcy and connecting with her at the very end, like in the morning, which is interesting if you think about the symbolism of that, right? That like if the entire book were going around in 24 hours, that they finally meet each other at dawn. Like they've gone through all these life events. But one of my favorite scenes between her and the father is when she comes to him and is like, this is who I want to be with. And the father's so taken aback, and then they're both crying, and he's like, he realizes they really do love each other and he met her standards. And he's like, I couldn't have parted ways with you for anybody less worthy. It's just such a beautiful moment.
It definitely is. And even like when, to go back to the Mr. Collins, when he says, when their mother, when Miss Bennet and Mr. Bennet are arguing, and he says, and if you do marry him, I will never talk to you, with Mr.
Yeah.
Collins. So
Starting at this point, you're going to have to stop speaking to one of your parents. Your mother will no longer speak to you if you marry him. I will no longer speak to you if you do.
yeah.
It makes me think, and this is turning us a little bit of projection or transference about where we exude Pride and Prejudice and first impressions. And if you ever, I don't know if you read this fact or little Easter egg, that she's reading a book at the beginning and you can see it's
It says
titled First Impressions.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it makes me think like, maybe we could talk about our first impressions of each other, or Pride and Prejudice. Where can you think about, do first impressions really matter? Like when you first met your husband, when you first met friends that you have in your life, can you think of how you would size somebody up that quickly?
Yeah. I mean, I guess too, we all, make judgments initially, right? But I do think that it's important to remember that people aren't always comfortable, or they're not always feeling their best, or, there's a lot of reasons. But I guess especially in our society, I would say first impressions are really important, but I don't think that they're always accurate. And obviously this movie is a really good example of that.
How have people, when they've described you, given the first impression? Do you ever feel like they said, oh, I thought you were this, but you actually were this after I got to know you?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I have always been told I have resting bitch face, and I have RBF. And then I'm told months or years later, well, actually, you're way nicer than I thought you were. And so that's something that I think bothered me maybe 10 years ago. And now it is what it is. But I wonder if it's something that I've actually worked through, of giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Well, I sourced some questions from ChatGPT. Did you have anything else top of mind before I consult with AI?
No. Maybe something else will come up once we start answering these questions, though.
Okay. I don't have a favorite one, but they're all social media based. So the first one is, if you were in a modern Pride and Prejudice scenario, which social media platform do you think Mr. Darcy would use to awkwardly express his feelings?
We talked about this. Obviously Twitter. He's not going to probably be on any other social media, I don't think.
I think he has a Twitter to monitor other people's. I would be shocked if Mr. Darcy actually divulged. If he did it under like a fake Twitter account.
Or he had like an old Facebook account that he had for like 20 years and just is like updated his photo every year.
Like he's definitely active on LinkedIn. That's where he's like, supporting people's accomplishments on LinkedIn. He's definitely has a Twitter account. The next one is on the same subject of social media. Which character in Pride and Prejudice would have the best Instagram feed, and what kind of posts would they share?
Well, I think that Jane would probably have an Instagram, I think. Posting
should be an influencer.
Pictures. Yeah.
Yeah.
Painting or posting pretty pictures. I think Lizzie probably would have Twitter, but I also think she might use Snapchat and just like snap her close group of friends about whatever's going on.
Lydia's posting thirst traps.
Yes.
Does Lydia
Kitty
have an
too.
OnlyFans?
Kitty too.
The mom is active on Facebook and Pinterest.
And everybody has her silenced.
Oh, everybody has her muted. She's been unfollowed. Yeah. And she's tagging other people and stuff. She's sharing random things directly and tagging other people. We know what she's having for dinner.
Oh, geez, Louise, geez.
Okay, so this is less about social media and more about what you were saying earlier, well, about like contemporizing it or reworking it a different way, which just like Bridget Jones, there's been so many ways of redoing the story that have been out there. I haven't watched, is it the Lizzie Diaries that are on YouTube? There
You
is
were
something
telling me about this.
happening.
I haven't watched it.
I've been told to watch it and they're really short, 10 minutes. It's something that is on my long list of things to do. But on that front, modernizing Pride and Prejudice, if it were happening in a contemporary office, what job do you imagine Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet would have? And would they still be as attracted to each other?
I feel like it would be like publishing or a newspaper or something like that.
Mm.
And obviously, Mr. Darcy would be a billionaire. And, you know, I think Lizzie would be actively trying to pursue a career in writing.
Yeah. Yeah. I was telling you this when I was perusing these questions the other day, but I definitely agree with you. He would be a billionaire. I think he would own a string of companies. It'd be similar to that of Mark Cuban. I never thought I'd
Or
be
Christian
comparing Mark
Grey.
Cuban. Yeah, Christian Grey, which probably has some inspiration from a Mr. Darcy. I can't believe in the same breath I just said Mark Cuban, Christian Grey, and Mr. Darcy. But he would own a string of companies, and I think he would interact with somebody at the social status of Elizabeth Bennet because she's probably a published writer, to your point, and maybe he's acquiring that publishing house, and they have to end up in the same social circles for that exact reason. And then as a result, his friend like falls in love with the sister. So I could see it in a modern day, but they seem to have to be forced to interact in balls. Like, what's the equivalent of balls in this day and age? Are people going? Are the same people going to
Happy
the same
hour?
parties?
Happy hour?
That's what a ball
Birthday
is.
parties?
I would choose a ball and a reason to wear an amazing dress over going to happy hour.
Or a gala? I mean, I don't know. I feel like people, social events, I mean, obviously it's a little different for you, but I feel like most of the time it's like birthday parties or holidays, not
Okay.
a quick get together.
All right. So if Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet are at happy hour and they play karaoke, what songs are they singing? I think Mr. Darcy's saying absolutely not. He doesn't
I was
want to
going to say he
be
would refuse. He'd probably refuse. I don't know
until
what I would
he
think Lizzie would sing.
until he found out that she valued not caring what people think, because he was willing, I wouldn't say adjust for her, but when she would give advice, like she says she wants to dance in the book, and then the next party that they're at,
They
he
dance.
asks her to dance. So let's say the first happy hour, if we're recreating this in 2024 or this day and age, she says, okay, singing at karaoke is like something that shows you don't take yourself too seriously and you put yourself out there. Because I think she's singing, and I think she's singing like 90s Alanis Morissette. Or she's doing Fast Car Tracy Chapman. She's doing something poetic, angsty from the 90s. Okay, so now we're in happy hour number 2. Karaoke happens, and he knows that she loves this. What do you think he's singing?
Oh, this is a tough question.
I feel like it's a rap song. I think it's 80s rap.
I feel like it's some like under the covers, like, I don't know. I was thinking like the Usher song, gosh, what is it?
Confessions.
Yes. Like just like something undercover that is like expressing how he feels without actually saying it.
It's probably You've Got It Bad.
Oh my gosh.
Or is it You Don't Have to Call? I do love that you chose R&B, In Their Feels, Usher, because I do think Elizabeth Bennet would appreciate just the 90s music in general, even though it was in it's 2024. I think that she would be inspired by early hip hop, anything Lilith Fair, 90s music, and I'm just totally projecting my own musical taste onto this.
I do wish that they redid this story in a really refreshing way.
Don't you think they will? If everything
I mean, I
comes
hope,
back
I
around.
mean, to be fair too, I do think that a lot of writers like take inspiration from this story and write their own, you know. Um,
Well, with that being said, those set of questions were more fun and pop culture-esque. And when we have these conversations on this podcast, we do tend to find the parallels between these characters, their story arcs, and what's going on in our own lives. And so I have a different set of questions that are a bit more on the lines of introspection. So one of them is, in a world that constantly promotes instant gratification and superficial connections, how does the slow burning romance between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy encourage us to prioritize deep connections and emotional intimacy?
well, I think this goes back to that quote I was talking about, where when they realize that, or Lizzie at least, she realizes that she's in something, she's in the middle of it, right? She doesn't even know when it started. And I think I think that it feels real too, this story. The reason that it's so attractive is not because it's like they instantly fall in love, right? It is a slow burn, and it is over time. And it's also, they spent a lot of time together. For as much as they didn't like each other, they spent a lot of time together, right? When Jane gets sick and then she goes to Bingley's house, and Lizzie's interacting with Mr. Darcy. And then again, when she's with her aunt and uncle. And so I do think that this story feels like it's has potential of being a true, like, you can relate to it. It's very relatable.
So here's my qualm. You just mentioned that they spent an exorbitant amount of time together. But if Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, it's Fitzwilliam Darcy, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, everybody always refers to him like by his proper title of Mr. Darcy. So if Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy were in today's day and age, like, that's my question, is, are there enough settings for people to even have a slow burn if they don't have reasons to have these in-person connections, because we can do everything behind a phone, that everything feels like it can be shallow and there is no time to build deep connections. And I don't know what the solution for that is, but that's where I wonder, is there even opportunity for there to be a slow burn?
Well, I think this would be like a coworker, or maybe like in your group of friends, like meeting one of their single friends. I think it's sort of like that situation. Like, you're interacting over time, but it's not intentional. Maybe it's like,
Yeah.
not as intentional, which I think even still, I think to your point, is probably difficult still.
Yeah. Going back to Lydia Bennet for a second, this question's interesting and is not triggering, but definitely giving me pause for thought. It says the character of Lydia Bennet embodies the consequences of impulsive decisions and a lack of self-control. Sorry, she is the perfect embodiment of impulsive decisions and a lack of self-control. So in a time when instant gratification seems more prevalent than ever, how can we learn from Lydia's mistakes and cultivate self-discipline in our own lives?
Well, I think that this question's a little unfair. She's like 17, and we're all like impulsive when we're a kid, and we're doing things that feel good, or we're doing things that we feel like are validating at the time. And I think it's just, I don't know. That's what I would say, is I think that she is doing, it's sort of like she's doing the best she can with what she knows.
That's true. And I mentioned this earlier, but I also think she's a bit of a copycat of her mother. And I'm not going to get into nature versus nurture. I'm not a scientist, but there's also 5 different sisters and they all have their own personalities. And you do get to see Elizabeth Bennet and Jane are older, to your point. And so they've gotten a chance to have more life experiences. And speaking as a younger sister, sometimes you want to be impatient. And I think Lydia was just impatient, hence why, spoiler alert to all of these podcasts, she ends up marrying Mr. Wickham. That was also one of my top cringeworthy moments, is when you find out she marries him.
And the fact that he like in the book, like, he continues trying to talk to Lizzie, and like she's like, no, stay away from me. Not really, but
a scene that I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that's taking us away from the questions, because when we were just talking about cringeworthy moments, but this is also one where I think I was the most proud of Elizabeth Bennet, is you think the movies, you don't really know where the movie's going to go, but when Mr. Darcy's aunt, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Catherine de Bourgh, I should know from how many times Mr. Collins
Lady
says her
Catherine.
name, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, when she comes in the middle of the night. So it's right after Lydia has ran away with Mr. Wickham, and they've been found, and you find out later it wasn't the uncle who paid for the wedding, but it was actually Mr. Darcy. And Elizabeth Bennet starting to see like this dude is actually like she's falling in love with him through his actions. And that's something men should take a note of is Mr. Darcy, his words and his actions align. But going back to the scene, Catherine de Bourgh, when she is just reaming Lizzie, and she stands up for herself, and whenever she's like, "And you promise never to marry him," and she's like, "I do not, and I never shall," and I mean, I've never clapped for a love story, a rom com, the way that I clap at a football game, the way that I do for Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah. I also, to go back to, what did you say about Mr. Darcy and
his actions and his words
oh
aligning?
yes, his actions and his words aligning. I think he also, what I was going to say about this is that Mr. Darcy also apologizes and takes responsibility for his actions. And
Totally.
I feel like it is so refreshing to see that and to, think about how clearly and how good that must have felt, obviously for these fictional characters, but for Lizzie, and also to see that, that she is telling him how she feels. And then he's like, okay, yes, I did this. And then explaining himself and taking responsibility for what he did or did not do. So I really love that.
Basically, Mr. Darcy, the reason why all women love him is because he's emotionally available. Maybe not at the beginning, but he shows emotional availability. And the best form of an apology is changed behavior. And Mr. Darcy embodies that.
Yeah, he does. He absolutely does.
Well, before we play Truth or Dare with the skeleton crew, with you and me, which I think you and I could talk about this for hours, what other questions come to mind? Is there anything we haven't talked about yet that is pivotal in the story that has to be said?
Okay, so something at the beginning of the book that everybody talks about. There's the quote. It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in a want of a wife. So obviously, this is like one of the first lines of the book, right? So setting this narrative in motion, how does this how does this impact the novel? I guess how do we as the audience how do we take that?
Will you read the quote one more time?
Yeah. It is truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And this goes back to also Mrs. Bennet being like, oh, Bingley's here, he has a lot of money, basically getting Mr. Bennet to go and talk to him to get him to invite the girls.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there that I can't do with brevity, but hopefully my response and not my reaction after hearing the quote twice now is that this is also why I really love characters like Elizabeth Bennet and Jo March, is because we have to acknowledge that fictional characters do end up having some sort of transcendence to our real lives in some way, shape, or form. And for Elizabeth Bennet, and that quote in particular, she wasn't just going to marry anybody. And also, Jo March really paved the way for this, dare I say, marched in that direction of not needing to marry. But at that particular time, you did have to marry as a business proposition, which is what Amy talks
transactional.
Right. It's what Florence Pugh talks about in Little Women. And it's, I'm going to just tell one more anecdote before I answer your question. So I was in London last year, and I was talking to a friend of mine and a colleague of mine, and I found out he had never seen Little Women and he had never seen Pride and Prejudice. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't talk to you until you go watch these movies. And so I said, I'll watch whatever 2 movies you want me to watch. And he gave me 2 Colin Farrell movies, The Banshees of Inisherin and In Bruges, which were both amazing movies for different reasons. One of them was problematic for a lot of reasons, but after he watched Pride and Prejudice, he said to me, it felt really anti-feminist because of this, I don't know, it being revolved around who are you going to marry, but that's what life was at that time. And I think that Jane Austen, I know that she brought a lot of attention to the fact that is so limiting for so many reasons. And I do think that around the world, a lot of people still feel that pressure that if a single man, he's missing something if he's not with somebody. Just like if you're a woman, we talked about in earlier episodes, where is value assigned? And so I'm not making one singular point. I'm just kind of like giving a bunch of different anecdotes. But I think that I'm glad you brought that quote to life, because I think that we've changed as a society, and that the more that we bring, and there's this story is redone, the more that we can reflect on how far that we've come. What about you?
No, I agree with everything you said. I do think though that this book, the movie, Lizzie is getting to choose her life choice. Like she's making life choices, right? And I think even for this time period when, they're not really working, they are, they're marrying. That's what they're doing, right? And you see it all in this, in the novel, in the story. But she is getting to make the choice. She is choosing for herself. And so I sort of disagree with obviously your coworker, because in a time when women didn't have a lot of choices, she still got to choose her future, or she chose her path. And obviously it was to a man, Mr. Darcy, but her happiness was what was most important to her.
It's funny because we talked about like all of these situations that would happen in this story. And I keep thinking, if there were a title for this now, and it wasn't Bridget Jones' Diary, it would be For Love or For Money. And obviously she ended up getting both, as did her sister Jane. But she ended up, to your point, she had the luxury of choice, which a lot of women today still don't have.
Yeah, it's true.
I feel like there's a part of this movie. I guess my final question for you before we move on to Truth or Dare, unless you have something else on your side, is like, this is a question Amina asked in an earlier episode, which is like, what was the beginning, what was the arc, and what was the end? I feel like there's something core to this movie that we haven't talked about. We talked a lot about a lot of my favorite scenes and a lot of yours, but what is your beginning, middle, and end, if you were summarizing this to somebody who hadn't interacted with this story?
I think the beginning for me is when they're at the first party, right? And Darcy and Lizzie are interacting. I think that that's the beginning for me. And then I think the middle, or the climax, is obviously when he tells her he loves her. And she's like, wait, what? And then I think the end for me is when she goes to his house, goes to, what is it called? I forgot what it's called. When she goes to his house, his home, and meets his sister. I think that is like when it's coming to, when the realization, the realization of where she is. Or what she wants, I should say.
Yeah, that's also a really great scene when she meets the sister, because going back to first impressions, when she meets the sister, she sees how much the sister loves him, and family is what she values, I think, more than anything else. And the relationship between the two of them, I think, cements the love that she has for him, or that love that had been building over time. Yeah, I agree with your beginning, middle, and end. But that scene where she sees his like bust, the statue, and then like one of the workers in the house is like, "Isn't he handsome?" Because her aunt and uncle that she's traveling with had never met him at that point. And then she also got to see them have a first impression of him. I'm sorry, for the first time, which is a really interesting, I don't know if dichotomy is the right word, but they were just enamored by him, and he was able to, he has a wall up all of the time. And I think somebody with, I guess, that level of success, whether it was handed to them or they built it on their own, like, you know, he had a lot of defense mechanisms,
Well,
and
also the
Elizabeth Bennet brought him
relationship,
down.
and also the relationship with Wickham, I think also like built those walls, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But when I was reading the book, his cousin, Fitzwilliam,
The Colonel
she
guy.
also, yeah, the Colonel, which interestingly in the book, I didn't realize this in the movie, but she, I think, was like, this is somebody I could marry, because they were able to have like a really interesting discourse. And I had never thought about
It's the
that
guy
in
in
the
the
movie.
church, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They're not, they don't say they're explicitly sitting in the church when he tells that story about how Darcy saved Bingley from, you know, disadvantageous marriage. Uh, but that's one thing when she's reflecting after that, that key letter that he wrote to her, basically saying this is my explanation for everything. But she reflected on that letter, because she said she cried for 30 minutes after that interaction with him where she shut him down for marriage. But reflecting on first impressions, every person she interacted with, minus Mr. Wickham, sang his praises. Like the people in his close circle all really cared about him and spoke highly of him, which I think most of us would have that. But going back to the ending being when she finally went to Pemberley and she was able to witness it firsthand, and she had two people with her that had never met him, that were able to be, he was softer, and he was vulnerable. And this goes back to like vulnerability being people's greatest strength. And he finally was able to show that by the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he was actually pretty vulnerable at the end. Even, I guess, even I would say when he tells her he loves her, I think he was being vulnerable then too.
Yeah, despite when he tells her that he loved
Even
her,
though all
despite
the bad, all of these things, all these negatives that she had.
yeah, and that's another time she's just queen of calling people out when she's like, and those are the words of a gentleman. Because he tells her in the middle he loves her despite her social status or lack thereof. And she's like, well, you'll be able to get over it for all the reasons that have like stopped you from saying it.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just such a perfect timeless story. Well, should we close out with Truth or Dare?
Yeah,
Pride or
let's do
Prejudice
it.
edition? Have you thought about it in advance, or do you have something impromptu?
Yeah, no, I think for this one, I'm going to go with truth. Um, because I think to some extent, we all, like, obviously going back to this idea of first impressions, right? We all hold these truths, but that doesn't mean that they're actually true, right? There are feelings, there are how we perceive things, but that doesn't make them fact. And and we base all of these things on our first impressions. And I think that for me, I really love learning about people. I love, getting to hear their stories and knowing what all of these things about them. And I think sometimes, my hope is that I don't always take just first impressions. I also take what I'm learning about them. And because I think ultimately everyone, as we've talked about before on the show or on the podcast, that everybody just wants to be seen and heard, right? And
Mhm.
I think that this idea of first impressions um, is something that we have to remember, that it's not always just that. It's not always fact. So
Mhm.
that's my truth, is
Mhm.
to try to make sure that I'm seeing the person and hearing them.
Totally. Well, I didn't have mine thought out until we were probably halfway through. I came to a conclusion that I'm going to choose dare, and it's to not come to a judgment and or have a prejudice on first impressions. But if there's a solution for that, it's what we spoke about already, which is waiting to see, do people's words and their actions align? Because I think that's what's telling about somebody's character, right? And that also is holding myself accountable to making sure that I do what I commit to. But that's what's sticking with me, is just even talking about, Mr. Darcy being somebody who embodies change behavior, because I think people make mistakes, but to your point, it's like, do they hold themselves accountable to it? And so character is, do words and actions align? And so I can't ask other people to do that if I don't do that myself. And so as I build relationships or cultivate pre-existing ones, that's probably what this story has inspired me to do. Cool. Well, we have come to a close on the Pride and Prejudice version of Truth or Dare to Share. I encourage you to give it some thought. What truths or dares would you walk away with after interacting with Lizzie Bennet or Mr. Darcy? So catch me, Cynthia, and the rest of us next time. Like, follow, share. We appreciate the support. See you later.
You're listening to Truth or Dare to Share by Ambitiously Intuitive.